everyone. I'm sure you are aware that this is a holiday weekend in the U.S. We commemorate and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the great civil rights leader. That means for many people a day off work or school. Many people will attend special Martin Luther King Day celebration. Others will participate in the National Day of Service to honor his legacy. But there's something missing from the national spotlight about this day. And that is that we honor not only Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader, but we honor Reverend Martin Luther King, the pastor, the great preacher of the gospel. And Reverend King first came to prominence when he was just 26 years of age as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he was recruited at that time to be the spokesman for the Montgomery bus strike, the bus boycott, which was a campaign by the African American population in that city to force integration of the buses in the city, to cause a change in the law that required African American passengers to ride only in the back of the bus and to yield the seats to white passengers if the front of the bus became full. And the African American passengers couldn't even walk through the front of the bus. They had to pay their fare and then get off the bus and walk around and get on at the back door. Now this boycott was kicked off in 1955 when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to yield her seat to a white passenger. And it went on for over a year, finally ending when the Supreme Court declared this unjust law to be unconstitutional, thus integrating the buses. And the boycott demonstrated the efficacy of this peaceful, nonviolent protest that became the hallmark of Reverend King's ministry as he sought to challenge racial segregation and other injustices in the South at that time. Now, the first reading for Mass today that we just heard, we heard a beautiful poem that is traditionally referred to as one of the 4 servant songs from the prophet Isaiah. And as I was praying and reflecting on this reading this past week, it occurred to me that this is a really appropriate reading for this Martin Luther King weekend. Because the servant songs were written at a time when Israel was in exile, where the chosen people were separated. They were segregated. And God calls this servant to bring those separated, segregated people back and to restore justice. And that is essentially what Reverend King was doing. He was working to end segregation in our country to bring about a more just society. Reverend King was called as a servant of God. He was a servant of God. He was a servant of God's people. And he did so with love and peace, without violence or malice. He did so at great personal risk, constantly being threatened, being unjustly jailed nearly 30 times. But this call to service that Reverend King answered is not an exclusively Christian concept. After all, Isaiah lived centuries before Christ. He was not a Christian, obviously, and yet he was called to service. And this call to service is not exclusive to the special few like Reverend King, like Isaiah. No, all people are called to service. All Christians are called to service. As Christians, we are called to service out of love. We are called to come to the aid of our brothers and sisters in need, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to comfort the sorrowing. We are called to stand up for justice and against injustice. And through the ministry of Reverend King, great strides were made in this country against racism and towards justice and equality for all. Racism is no longer codified in law as it once was. But there's still a tremendous amount of work to do. The ugly face of racism still exists in our country. And in recent years, it seems to have experienced a resurgence. We see in the news attacks on people of color, violent attacks on our Jewish brothers and sisters and other people of faith. We see other examples of injustice in our culture. Injustice against the unborn, against immigrants and refugees, against homeless, just to name a few. Reverend King was doing the work of the gospel. He was doing the work of Jesus Christ. And that work is as yet unfinished. And all Christians today are called to take up that work to the extent that we are able. We are called to stand up for love, to stand up for justice. And so it is appropriate for us to ask ourselves the question, how am I called to serve? How am I called to stand up for justice? How am I called to do the work of the gospel, the work of Jesus Christ in my community? Am I blind to injustices around me, not seeing them for what they truly are? Or am I aware of injustices around me and yet choose to not stand up against them? It's not easy to stand up for justice. But nobody said that being Christian is easy. It's easy to do nothing. But doing the right thing can be hard. This morning we gather, or this evening we gather as a community of faith to be nourished by the precious body and blood of our Lord Jesus, to listen to God's holy word. It is appropriate for us to pause for a moment and to reflect on the servant songs of the prophet Isaiah, to reflect upon the example of the Reverend Martin Luther King. My prayer for all of us this evening is that we will answer the call to service that God has for each and every one of us. That we will hear and recognize the cries for justice around us, and that we will respond in truly Christian ways.